All right, we're starting with Module 10, the Groundwater Rule. And upon successful completion of this module, hopefully you'll have a little better understanding of the Groundwater Rule. You'll be able to actually discuss some of the components in this rule and why this rule is so important. Now, on a routine basis, groundwater is tested for all the primary pollutants how often? Anybody know? How often do you think your water is tested for the primary contaminants? Every quarter? Monthly? Huh? Quarterly? Monthly? Any other throwouts? Would it shock you to know that groundwater is tested once every 3 years? Once every 3 years. Surface water sources once every year. Which contaminants are we talking about? If you'll turn in your module to 5-7, you'll see a list of the EPA primary pollutants of concern on those few pages. 5-7, there's a whole table, several pages there. Those are the contaminants that we are looking for and are concerned with. And as you can see, some of them are naturally occurring. Others are things that we're adding in, such as disinfectants. So the groundwater rule, we're interested in that particular rule because, number one, most groundwater is filtered. And so pretty much a lot of the contaminants are removed because of the filtration process, especially the organics. However, water being the universal solvent, as it's matriculating and moving through the ground, it's doing what? Also picking up impurities such as gases and minerals and things like that. And so by the time it gets to the aquifer, there still can be some contamination. In addition to those dissolved minerals and gases, there have been cases also where we've had some pathogens located in groundwater. And so the groundwater rule kind of takes into consideration once you get a hit or positive coliform in the distribution system, you're going back to your source and you're pulling and you're checking for fecal contamination there also. So we're going to look at the regulatory overview of the groundwater rule. We're going to also identify various methods for compliance. In other words, once you have this hit and it shows that there's fecal contamination, what do you need to do in order to comply with the rule? Sometimes it may be additional monitoring. Sometimes it may be introducing some other type of technical treatment in order to make sure that you're meeting the state requirements. And so we're going to visit those items. Now, we still have a lot of systems that are getting their water from groundwater, although again in Texas, for the most part, we're going to surface water. And the reason we're going to surface water is because we're sinking. We're pulling so much out of the ground, it's not being replenished fast enough, and so the mandate is towards surface so we can minimize subsidence that's occurring. However, 33% of all the population or public water supplies are still from groundwater. In other words, we're removing it from the water-bearing formations, aquifers, some of them very shallow, some of them very deep. Now, what type of contamination risk? Because we've already said if water is moving through the ground, it's being filtered. So what are some of the possible contamination issues that we have with groundwater? Speak real loud. Huh? Sewers, absolutely. Most of our sanitary sewers are gravity fed, but we do have force mains too. But with a gravity fed sewer, if there's a break in the line, do we know 9 times out of 10 when that break happens? No, we don't. So it can leach down into especially a shallow well very, very easily. So sewer, Septic tanks could be another possible contamination. California, a few years ago, they had issues with MTBEs. And again, that was from their underground storage for fuel. It was leaching out into their groundwater source, so possible contamination there. Agricultural. We see a lot of fields driving through Louisiana, so you all do lots of farming here. They irrigate that crop, right? They also probably use pesticides and herbicides. Is there a catch basin where you can capture all that water? Where is it going? Down in the ground and running off into your surface water. So another source of possible contamination. And because of that, we're going to get, with all the fertilizer, lots of nitrates and nitrites. And why are we concerned about those? Because they produce blue baby syndrome. So another source of contamination. And then you have the oil, gas, and industrial injection well that may also lead to some type of contamination of our groundwater sources. So all kinds of contamination that can get into our groundwater. Now, your final rule as far as the groundwater rule was established or promulgated in 2006 from EPA, and the goal was to reduce the risk of exposure to fecal contamination. What is fecal contamination? Sewage, poop, intestinal waste. Yes, that can get into groundwater also. You have all kinds of organic animals and things that's in the soil, and so they will have intestinal waste also from sewage, which carries our intestinal waste. However, EPA does not believe that most groundwater is fecally contaminated, but because there is a possibility, there is a rule. And the purpose of the rule was to take a risk strategy, targeted strategy, to identify those groundwater systems that may be at high risk for fecal contamination. That's the whole purpose of the rule. Now, also another portion of this rule will specify when correction action is required. Who remembers when the Safe Drinking Water Act was promulgated? 73, 74, very good. 1974 is when there were national standards established for actually having standards across the board for testing our drinking water. 1986, we had the first major amendments. With the 86 Amendment, there was stipulation all, and all means all public water systems were to disinfect their water. In other words, everybody was using some form of chlorination or disinfection. In 1996, EPA kind of did a moonwalk backwards. Why? Because of outrage with the people. A lot of people don't like putting chemicals in their water. A lot of people were saying, well, my groundwater doesn't need disinfection. It is good, pure, pristine water. So in 96, the stipulation was as necessary to provide disinfectant as necessary to protect public health. Because of that, a lot of systems nowadays, especially up in the northeastern part of the country, they do not disinfect their groundwater. Do you all disinfect your groundwater? Is it mandatory statewide to disinfect your groundwater? Yes? Okay. What is the minimum? Yes, go ahead. Okay, now I just heard yes from everybody. You said there's only one that actually, that does not. So they have some type of waiver or something, or? No. They would, and usually that's what the key is. As long as you can prove that you have the 99.99% inactivation of viruses or 3-log reduction of bacteria and so forth, you don't have to provide disinfection of your groundwater system. However, there is a law in Louisiana that says your distribution system must maintain a chlorine residual. So you may not be disinfecting it for treatment, but once it goes into the distribution system, you have to meet that 0.2 at the farthest reaches of your distribution system. All right, so they did lots of studies, especially in the late 60s, early 70s, prior to getting the actual Safe Drinking Water Act together, and afterwards, and they did find out there's pathogenic viruses and bacteria that do occur in the public groundwater sources, and that was a big thing. They do occur. What do we mean by pathogenic? Disease causing. Okay. Now, another question that comes to mind. If Calvin is a healthy person, disease-free, and I come in contact with his intestinal waste, will I get a disease? I'm good? I could. He's healthy. He's disease-free. Do I get a disease? He's healthy, disease-free. Do I get a disease? No. Now, if I have an intestine that is diseased, and I know I have pathogenic organs in my body, he comes in contact with my waste, is there a possibility that he may get the disease? Yes, and that is the key. When we find intestinal waste in our water sample, there's only a risk because we don't know if the persons or the animals have any disease. But because there is a risk, we have the rules in place for testing. Do we test for all pathogenic organisms? No, we don't. We use one group, and that's the coliform group. And when they are present, that lets us know there is a possibility. Within the coliform group, we have fecal species, we have non-fecal species. If we get a positive on the non-fecal species, not that big of a deal. We got 30 days to tell our public. If we get a positive and it shows that intestinal waste is there, we got 24 hours to get that information out. Non-fecal species are naturally occurring. They're probably on my skin and your skin as we speak. They're in the soil, they're in water, they're all around us. Healthy people rarely have to seek medical attention when they come in contact, again, with waste that may have some pathogenic organisms. Gastrointestinal symptoms rarely cause us to go to the doctor. In other words, we may feel queasy, but like the common cold, it'll run its course. However, those that have a compromised immune system, the very young, the very old, they will exhibit more serious complication, and some of those complications may even lead to death. And so because we have a specialized group, whereas they can be affected, we make sure that there are rules in place to protect all. Okay, other types of contamination that can get into our groundwater source, if we have a compromised well, if the casing is not properly cemented, constructed or protected or maintained, then it can possibly contaminate our groundwater source. If our wells are out in the middle of pastures where you have all kinds of cattle around, that's a possible contamination issue. That's the reason with public wells, it's mandatory that they have to be so many feet from any source of possible contamination. All right, so our rule risk targeting approach will look at 4 components. The first component will be your sanitary surveys. How many of you all have gone through the process of having to do a sanitary survey? Has the state come and visit you? Okay, Robert, how did that go for you? Okay, good. What they do is come out and they look at 8 areas, starting with the source water, where you're getting your water from. They look at treatment, distribution. They look at all of your records, compliance, monitoring. So what you have to do in order to get ready for a sanitary survey is make sure you have all your paperwork in a row. when they come out. They will do a walkthrough inspection, and then at the end of that survey, they will list deficiencies in which they noted, and they will give you time to correct those deficiencies. So that's one component to identifying whether or not you have issues. Now, for most community water systems, your first sanitary survey was done and completed by December 2012. For those outstanding performers, they have until 2014 to do their first ones. What do we mean by outstanding performers? No violations, no issues there. So they're given a little longer time to complete theirs. Another component of the groundwater rule is source water monitoring, and that's where you're actually getting your water from. So one of the things that will trigger additional monitoring is when you have that positive coliform from the distribution system. You're going to go back and get your repeat sample from the distribution system, but because of the groundwater rule, now you have to go to each of your water sources, your groundwater source, pull a sample for E. coli, enterococcus, or coliphage also. Another component would be corrective action. Now, Robert, when you got the deficiencies, what did you do?
We were there when they did the sanitary survey. We had the body materials, so we had to do
Correct them, very good. Super, super. And that's one of the things, that's what they're trying to make sure that we are doing, is correcting all the deficiencies. Now, what happens if I have a water in which I cannot correct the deficiency? I worked for a private company in which we had some radiological contaminants in a well, and it was too expensive to have them removed, and so there was no correction. So you know what we had to do? Abandon the well, find another water source. That's another possible corrective action. Okay, so we're going to look at like 4 different corrective actions. I could introduce some type of treatment technology, such as disinfection, to prove that I'm meeting the 4-log reduction. That's a corrective action. So they're going to give you a toolbox of corrective actions to make sure that you're meeting the rule itself. And then compliance monitoring is the 4th component. If I introduce a new treatment technology, suppose I introduce ultraviolet radiation in order to help me out, okay? Then I have to make sure I have some way of checking the integrity of my lamps over time. Or if I'm introducing a membrane filter, I have to make sure that I'm staying in compliance with whatever treatment technology I'm introducing. So we're going to look at each of the 4 components with the sanitary surveys. Again, we're going to the source. We're looking for possible contamination in and around the source waters where we're pulling from, or our well if that's the source. Then we're going to walk through the treatment schematic. For most groundwater systems, what type of treatment is mandatory? Usually just disinfection, that's it. Some of you all may add some type of polyphosphate if you have an iron problem, or fluoride, but usually not much is done treatment-wise to groundwater unless you have a special case, you have a high mineral content or gas and you have to remove that with aeration or something like that. So they will review your treatment scheme. They'll look at your distribution system and ask you for the results from the distribution system. What type of results are we looking at there? Our bacteriological sampling, chlorine residuals, something else. How many of you all do total trihalomethanes and haloacetic acid? You're going to have to pull those records for review also. They're going to look at your finished water storage. What does your clear well look like, or your ground storage, or your elevated? Do you have corrosion problems with those entities? How often are you inspecting your storage facilities? Do you all do annual inspections? Every 3 years? Every 5 years? Okay, All of that they're going to review. How often are you cleaning them out? Do you have a foot or 2 feet of sand in the bottom of that ground storage tank? Pulling lots of information. What about your pumping stations, your pump facilities, your controls? If you have SCADA, they're going to review all of that too. Then they will look at the management. How many certified operators do you have? Do you have the correct number based on your population? Are the certificates up to date? Are they in compliance with the state requirements as far as what is required for the number of operators? So the sanitary survey can be very in-depth. It may take anywhere from a few hours. I've seen some that have taken days, mainly because all the paperwork was not there initially, so they had to make additional trips. All right, after the survey, they're going to look at your source water. And again, they want you to do the testing for the E. coli, the enterococci, or the colophage to see if they're present in the sample. E. coli is more specific for freshwater type organisms. Enterococcus, if you have groundwater that has some type of brackish or saline intrusion, and then colophage can also be used. Now, trigger monitoring will occur if your systems do not provide a 4-log inactivation of viruses. That will trigger additional monitoring, or if your system have a total positive routine sample under the total coliform rule. And that's from your distribution system. So again, when I get that positive from my distribution system, I have to go to my source, pull a sample also. Now, assessment monitoring, EPA gives the state lots of leeway on the assessment monitoring component. The state can say once you have the positive from your groundwater source, the state can decide whether or not you go immediately in some type of treatment or compliance corrective action mode, or whether or not you will continue to collect additional samples. Question? You couldn't hear? Okay, it's good now. Okay, I'm sorry. Cool. All right, so the state has that leeway to decide that. 9 times out of 10, size has everything to do with it. And what do I mean by that? If you are a medium to large system, then automatically they're going to put you on some type of state plan. If you are a smaller system, they usually have more leniency with your smaller systems there to work with you. Now, corrective action was another component. Corrective action simply means if you find deficiency or if they note you on deficiencies, then you have up to 120 days to rectify it. So you fix the deficiency. You can also eliminate the source of contamination. And how do we do that? Sometimes by employing other types of treatment option that may not be on the table. You can provide an alternative water source. As I said with us, we actually abandoned the well, dug another well less than a mile down the road that didn't have the same problems. And that worked. That was an alternate water source. That is a corrective action. Or you can provide some type of treatment to prove that you're meeting a 4-log inactivation or removal of viruses. So those are the toolbox that EPA gives that you can do. And then compliance monitoring, whatever treatment technique you've installed, you have to make sure that the integrity of that treatment technology is in place. In other words, you're going to have to do additional monitoring, send those samples to the lab to make sure you're getting that 4-log reduction. Okay, so those are the 4 components again to recap: sanitary surveys, triggered monitoring, assessment monitoring, compliance monitoring. Now, non-community systems have to complete the sanitary surveys every 5 years. My question to you, what is a non-community water system?
Less than 25?
What is a non-community?
Recreation area.
Okay, that's a good start. With all systems, remember we have the public water system. That's the whole umbrella again. All public water systems must have a minimum of 15 service connections, right? 25 individuals minimum, 25 individuals. And if you are a community system, you will provide service how long? A year, year long. In other words, 365 days. This is the difference between community versus non-community. Non-community system still have the minimum of 15 service connections, minimum of 25 individuals, but they only have to provide service for a minimum of 6 months out of the year. Okay, so it can be recreational areas. They will be considered transient. People are coming and going. Hotels and motels, transient. We also have the non-transient non-community systems where we have 25 of the same individuals. These are people that are not coming and going, and these are the ones we're concerned with. Examples would be daycares, rural schools, factories, industries. You have 25 of the same individual. They are there at least 6 months out of the year. Now you can provide service longer, but at a minimum 6 months out of the year. They have their own water system number. So with non-community system, every 5 years. Community water system, how often? Every 3 years. And if you're an exceptional, stellar performer, you get a little longer. You get 5 years. That means you have no deficiencies, no violations. They give you longer time to comply with the rule. Make sense? Excellent. All right, now with the trigger monitoring for your small entities. Now, what do we mean by small entities? EPA has deemed or defined small entities as those systems with under 3,300 people. Anywhere from 3,300 to 10,000, that's a medium. Anything above 10,000, that is a large system. So small systems, and I think in your manual you have them for all size, but because the grant is geared towards small system, we really stress that. With small entities, you got to collect source water from each well that's in production the day you get the positive total coliform. So if you have 2 wells working, guess what? You got to go pull those 2 samples and check for the E. coli. And that's within 24 hours of the total positive coliform. You will collect these samples prior to treatment. Now what happens once you run the analysis on your source water and you get a positive on the source water? We already know if we get a positive on the other side what happens, right? If I get a positive from the distribution and I have more than 1 routine samples, I'm going back to 3 locations to pull samples, right? Going back to the original site, within 5 connections upstream, within 5 connections downstream. Now I'm also going to the source. If my source is also positive, within 24 hours I'm collecting how many more samples? In addition to the distribution samples, 5 more source samples. That's what the rule is saying. Now here, note, the state at this time can direct the system to take corrective action in lieu of collecting the additional samples, and that's where they have the leeway, the authority, and usually with smaller systems, they'll say, okay, we'll give you more time, or we want you to pull the samples, or we want you to go directly to the corrective action. That means we got to be in constant contact with the state on our results so we'll know which way they want us to go. So if they say go do corrective actions, you don't have to do the additional 5 samples. Does it make sense, or is it clear as mud? Okay, you got it, Lynn? He's like, yeah. All right, additional trigger monitoring. If we have a positive distribution sample with more than 1 groundwater source, we've already said we're collecting from each source that's in use. Triggered source samples must be collected within 24 hours of the positive, and then the state has the leeway to give you more time in order for collection to occur. But usually the 24 hours is standard. They may also request you do additional study to see whether or not your groundwater is in a hydrogeological sensitive area. And so they have the right to request that. And that's, again, if you're having all of these problems with your source, you need to identify the root cause is the baseline there. Now, in your book, you do have this one here. If your system serves 3,300 or fewer people, what you must do once you're in this area for compliance monitoring. Let's say that you're monitoring and you get below the 0.2 milligrams per liter chlorine residual in your distribution system. It's below 0.2. What do they want you to do with the ground rule when that happens? What do you do right now when it falls below 0.2? You never have that problem? No? Never falls below 0.2. Come on, quit trying to sell me a bag of wooden nickels. Never had to repair a line where, huh? You do a boil water notice or something like that. Well, with the groundwater rule, if it drops below 0.2, what they want you to do is to start doing additional testing every 4 hours until it's back up to where it needs to be. Now, in the meantime, of course, you're doing your operator responsibilities to bring it back up. So that's what it's saying here. It says you must monitor by taking a daily grab sample during peak hours, and if it falls below the state-determined residual concentration, follow up every 4 hours until it's back where it needs to be. But I guess if it never falls below 0.2, you never have a problem, huh? But now you know what to do, what you're supposed to do when it does fall below 0.2. All right, we already talked about the corrective actions. Correct any deficiencies, eliminate the source, provide an alternative water source, or achieve and prove that you are achieving before log inactivation and removal of viruses. All right, corrective actions, you got 30 days. Okay, once you are notified of positive samples, that 5 of the additional source samples also fecal positive indicated, you got to notify the state, of course, within the 24-hour period and make the correction within 30 days. If you're notified by the state of significant deficiency, again, corrective actions must be taken care of within 30 days here. Or if the state notify you to take corrective action for a fecal positive followed by a total, you got 30 days in order to start your assessment for your source water. Within 120 days, the state gives you 120 days if you're on the more rigorous one and you have to develop a state plan schedule in order to make sure that you remain in compliance. You have up to 120 days to develop this state-specific plan. You have to submit the plan and schedule as to your monitoring, what you're going to do to the state. Now, you don't get another 120 days. All of this is from within the 120 days of notification. And you have to make sure you're complying with whatever deficiencies they've written you up within 120 days. Okay? Now, if the state approve or direct treatment or disinfection as a corrective action, compliance monitoring is required to evaluate the effectiveness. In other words, I say, okay, I want to put in some type of membrane to help me to achieve the 4-log. Then I have to check and make sure the integrity of that membrane is maintained at all times. So, continuous monitoring. Now, also with the groundwater rule, we have portion of the public notification rule. And the public notification rule is to keep the public, your consumers, your clients, people who are using the water, to keep them informed of what's going on with their water. After all, we're just the champions of the environment, taking care of it for our clients, right, and for ourselves. So we have 3 tiers of notification, tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 being the more rigorous one. We have 24 hours for anything that falls under Tier 1 to notify the public. In other words, with Tier 1s, it is an immediate threat to life or health. And so I need to get that information out ASAP. If there is fecal contamination in my water source, that's an immediate danger. I need to get that information out to my consumers so they can opt to boil their, well, not an option. We tell them to boil their water or use another alternative source. So fecal contamination, Tier 1. With Tier 2 notification, EPA says I have 30 days to get that information out. So do you think it's as serious as a Tier 1? No. So what falls under Tier 2? If I fail to collect source water fecal contamination after I have that positive total from the distribution, that's a Tier 2. I just didn't collect my sample, my source water, and test for fecal. I have 30 days to let the public know, oops, I goofed up, did not collect the sample I was supposed to. Or if I did not correct a significant deficiency within 120 days, I have to notify the public. I'm not being that champion of the environment and doing what the state told me I need to do for the corrective action. Now let me also point this out. When you fail to do that, you can also incur enforcement. Be aware of that. So you don't ever want them to give you a deficiency and a deadline and you not do it, because that can lead to enforcement. Ask me how I know. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt and the mark on my back to show it. Failure to meet the performance monitoring or reporting requirements. In other words, if you fail to check the integrity of whatever treatment technology to prove the forelog, I have to come back and let the consumers know I did not do that within 30 days. That's the Tier 2. Tier 3, how long do you think we have to notify the public with Tier 3s? Tier 1 was within 24 hours. Tier 2s were within 30 days. So for Tier 3s, 12, you go. You don't even need me here today. I have 12 months. I have a year to notify the public. Out of sight, out of mind. So these deficiencies that fall under the Tier 3s are usually things that are not serious at all. And what we can do is put it on the CCRs. How many of you all know what CCRs are? Yeah, Patrice like, yeah, I know exactly what they are. This is that yearly report the EPA mandates to let consumers know what's in their water. So with Tier 3s, if I fail to collect source water after total coliform positive, that's a Tier 3. Wait a minute, Bessie. You said if you fail to collect one fecal after fecal indicator in the groundwater source is a Tier 1. What's the difference? Fecal indicated positive and a total coliform positive. Because we're still talking about the coliform organisms or the group. It's not what? Very good. The positive and very good. The total are naturally occurring. So when I have that positive, again, it's not that serious because they're naturally occurring in the water. But when there's intestinal waste, I don't know who or what infected, that's an immediate action. Very good. If the state requires assessment of source water monitoring, that can also go in that CCR 12-month period notification, or if a significant deficiency is not corrected by the next 12-month period. In other words, if I got a Tier 3 and I don't correct it, then it becomes another Tier 3. Again, you don't want to get in the cycle of not doing what the state wants you to do, though.
So what you're saying, if you have a 12-month notice and you don't correct it, you go back and can't give you another 12 months?
Yeah, if it's not a serious one. Yeah. All right. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns, or issues with the groundwater rule? So you'll be able to recant back to me everything we just said, without a doubt. What are the key elements of the groundwater rule? I'm packing my bags and going home. Anybody? Key elements of the groundwater rule. Why do we have a groundwater rule? Good, to check for fecal contamination. Thank you so much. You saved the day.
Hey, is the total, the total could have fecal in it, or?
No, two different species. The coliform group has a lot of different species. So it has a non-fecal species as well as a fecal species. And of the fecal species, E. coli is one, Enterococci is one, the coliphage is also one. And so your total coliforms also have names that I don't know, that, are groups that are non-fecal. In other words, because they're naturally occurring, they don't come from the intestinal waste. But the fecal components come from intestinal waste of warm-blooded organisms. Good question. All right, so we know why we have the groundwater rule to check for fecal contamination. Okay, what's the main component of the groundwater rule? Super, super, super. Those are the 4 components. All right, with that said, then I can hush up on the groundwater rule. Okay. So next we have a video, and then after the video we will take a break. What time do you have? 9:30? All right, we have about a 17-minute video. Then we'll take the only morning break you'll get, and then we'll finish up with the morning session prior to lunch, okay? Y'all hear that?
Analyzing drinking water throughout the distribution system. Water suppliers regularly test for many contaminants, whether chemical, biological, or physical. Microbiological contamination is monitored by routine testing for
12, right? Because I told her to have it here about 11, between 11:30 and 12. I had to call and forgot to tell her the number.
representative water samples. Representative, reliable sampling, and well-managed monitoring are essential to providing safe drinking water. No water system is perfect. Treated water, even, is not sterile, but pathogens, disease-causing organisms, should be absent. Total coliform bacteria are commonly found in untreated water. Thus, this class of bacteria is a good indicator of the effectiveness of treatment, and their presence may indicate a possible contamination of the water supply. When a water utility detects total coliform bacteria in a sample, their presence may or may not be an indication of a serious water contamination problem. Nonetheless, every total coliform positive sample must be checked, just in case. When total coliform bacteria are detected, the system is then checked for Escherichia coli, or E. coli, normally associated with fecal contamination, since these bacteria can be a sign that the system could also be compromised by disease-causing organisms. This is why, when sampling finds a positive total coliform, it is tested for E. coli, a bacterium that should not be found in the finished water of the distribution system. Contamination in the distribution system can occur through a cross-connection, an unprotected storage tank, a water main break, or the installation of a new main. The Safe Drinking Water Act, originally passed by Congress in 1974 to protect public health by regulating the nation's public drinking water supply, includes regulations mandating coliform bacteriological sampling. The Total Coliform Rule, or the TCR, requires all public water systems to collect samples and have them analyzed and reported monthly. The TCR's objective is to monitor treatment effectiveness, distribution system integrity, and to detect fecal contamination should it occur. The ability to test for every individual bacterial, viral, and protozoan pathogens is still not practical. Instead, water is examined for indicator organisms. So the coliform group of bacteria is used as an indicator of a water system's integrity. Coliform bacteria are easily detected in water and may indicate the presence of contamination. Representative sampling of the distribution system helps alert water providers to potential problems and represents an integral part of the effort to protect the public health. The minimum number of samples required is specified in the Total Coliform Rule and varies based on population served by the water system. However, some states require more stringent sampling test frequency. So every water provider should consult its state to determine the number of samples required and the frequency of sample collection for each community. The TCR also requires every public water system to develop a written sampling plan that is subject to state approval. The plan includes the minimum number of samples required, how often the samples must be collected, and a detailed description of where sampling will occur. Getting a good representative sample for total coliform testing is critical, as is selecting a good sample location. The primary considerations for the sampling sites include representation of the different water sources entering the system and representation of conditions throughout the distribution system. Conditions affecting the microbiological quality of the water must be taken into consideration. For example, the location of water storage facilities, varying population densities, pressure zones, dead-end or low-flow mains and grids, and areas of historical water quality problems. Systems may use different sampling locations when they collect samples, or they may use fixed sample locations. Sampling sites may include public or municipal buildings such as libraries, fire stations, and schools, or may be located in the homes of customers. The faucets should be carefully selected to provide samples that are representative of the water in the local main and not of the customer's plumbing system. Sampling faucets should not be located near the ground and, if possible, should be inside a residence or building to avoid environmental contamination. Faucets utilizing separate controls for the hot and cold water should be chosen, with only the cold water tap used for sampling. Faucets that use a single lever controller for both the hot and cold water should not be used. Do not sample from homes or businesses where the water has undergone additional treatment, like a water softener, carbon filter, or any point-of-use treatment device. Avoid faucets located in industrial, janitorial, or cleaning supply storage areas where the risk of accidental contamination is high. Such contamination can occur on the faucet or during sample collection. Here's an example to illustrate how faucet contamination can affect sampling results. A few years ago, the City of San Diego Water Department had an incident of total coliform positive tests, not alarming, but still unusual compared to past experiences and thousands of tests a year. The problem was traced back to samples taken in schools, libraries, and community centers where the water was being collected from drinking water fountains, kitchens, and bathrooms. The problem was multifold. Poor pressure in the drinking water fountains meant the sample collected represented water that had been fairly stagnant in the pipes. Also, kids had been placing their mouths directly on the faucet. The sinks in the bathrooms and kitchens were suspected of being prone to environmental contamination, such as from water splashing. There was nothing wrong with the drinking water. The samples were simply showing the presence of bacteria at the tap, when in fact the water coming from the distribution system was free of coliform bacteria. Contamination that comes from unsanitary or unrepresentative sampling taps results in costly and time-consuming repeat sampling. Even worse contamination events must be reported to the state agencies and to the public, which undermines confidence in their water supplier. San Diego overhauled its sampling program, installing permanent sampling stations, and went from 5 positives per week to 0 per week at those locations. Other water utilities, like Philadelphia, have addressed this same issue and have installed dedicated sampling stations and have experienced improved data quality. They provide an opportunity for quality control and can save time and money for the utility since the sampling location is fixed and under the control of the water provider. So, always check the sampling site and inspect the test faucet tap. Avoid using faucets with interior threads, strainers, hoses, point-of-use purification devices, or anything that causes mixing or churning of the water as it flows from the tap. Remove any aerator on a tap before sampling. Taps with aerators should be avoided when possible. Some water suppliers, like San Diego and Philadelphia, have installed permanent sample taps. They provide an opportunity for quality control and can save time and money for the utility, since the sampling location is fixed and under the control of the water provider. It is important to remember that to get a good sample for testing is using proper sampling techniques. This ensures that you have not accidentally contaminated the sample yourself. Improper sampling techniques are often the most common problem in sampling. Mistakes made during sampling may result in poor data quality for monitoring. The key is correct sampling in the field, which begins with preparation and execution. Begin by assembling all of the sampling supplies needed. These include sterile sample bottles, extra bottles in case one gets dirty, gloves with which to take samples without contaminating the sample, and clean coolers to store the samples in with ice or cold packs. The laboratory that will eventually test the samples usually provides the container or recommends one. Pre-sterilized glass containers may be used but may break during shipping. Plastic tends to be a more popular choice. A dechlorination chemical agent is needed if sampling waters contain residual chlorine, which is present in the distribution system. This chemical is already in the pre-sterilized sample bottles, so don't wash out the bottle used for total coliform sampling. After arriving at the sampling site, check the tap to make sure that it is in good working condition. It should be clean, free of attachments, and in good repair or without leaks. Remember to remove any aerator and to make sure the hot water is turned off. Some water utilities use alcohol or a chlorine solution or wipes to clean faucets before or between uses. These methods are not always necessary if the sampling site and tap are properly selected and maintained. Paying close attention to details is the key to good sampling technique. Keep records of any unusual observations at time of sampling. Begin sampling by opening the cold water tap and letting the water run for 2 minutes or until the water temperature stabilizes to clear the service line. This time can be used to fill out the label or tag. Always use waterproof ink. The sample forms can also be filled out immediately following the collection of the sample, but should be completed as soon as possible to ensure the information is accurate. Set the flow at a rate that is neither too fast nor too slow. Too fast means that the water might splash and introduce contamination not originally found in the water. Too slow simply means that the sample bottle and cap are exposed to potential contamination more than they need to be. Make sure that the flow is consistent and steady. Do not alter the flow once you've begun the process, as it might dislodge biofilm or scale in the line. When the bottle lid is removed, hold its threads down and do not touch the inside of the cap. Remember that the inside of the cap and bottle have been sterilized. Do not set the cap down or place it in a pocket. If the bottle lid becomes contaminated, it may contaminate the sample. Do not rinse out the bottle before collecting the sample, and do not touch any portion of the inside of the bottle. Although not required by regulations, wearing gloves during the sampling process is recommended. Now, collect the sample, leaving airspace as directed, according to the type of sample container used. If you make a mistake, discard the sample bottle and select a new one and start over. When finished, carefully replace the bottle lid, tighten, and place in the cooler on ice or ice packs and out of the sunlight. Keep sample bottles upright and avoid letting them become submerged in melted ice water. Recheck the information on the label and complete any unfinished forms that came with the sample bottle, including the chain of custody form. When transporting, keep the samples at less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit or below 10 degrees Celsius. Total coliform samples must reach the testing laboratory within 30 hours. Samples may be delivered to the lab or sent via overnight delivery. The samples must be analyzed within 30 hours of the sampling, regardless of when they are delivered. Any sample not processed within the required time frame will be rejected, so know the lab's schedule and whether they are closed on weekends and/or holidays. If a sample is rejected by the lab or lost during transport to the lab, recollect a replacement sample at the same sample location as soon as possible. If any routine sample is identified as total coliform positive, repeat sampling is required, as well as a check for the presence of E. coli. Repeat sampling must be done within 24 hours of learning of a total coliform positive result. At least 3 repeat samples must be collected and analyzed. Access to extra sample bottles is needed to allow this to occur. 1 repeat sample must be collected from the same tap as the original sample. Another must be collected within 5 service connections upstream, and the third from within 5 service connections downstream. Clearly label each sample. Repeat sampling does not confirm or deny the original positive coliform sample. It is designed as follow-up action to make sure that nothing more serious is happening at that location in the distribution system. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also requires public notification when a maximum contaminant level, or MCL, violation occurs. In situations of acute MCL violations, the public must be notified within 24 hours. If a monthly MCL violation occurs, the public must be notified as well. An acute MCL violation occurs when E. coli is detected in one of the 2 positive coliform samples from the original and repeat sampling. Phoenix, New York, located in northern central New York State, is home to about 2,200 residents, most of whom never gave their drinking water much thought until the utility received notice of positive coliform test samples from the distribution system.
There was a day where we actually had to call the principal and have him bag the drinking fountains because of the positive E. coli. It was not confirmed after that, but to be safe. So the awareness level in the community was quite high about water issues. And they wanted to make sure the water quality was good.
They began an investigation to determine if the problem was from one of their 2 wells or was within their distribution system.
We can It was very important to make sure that the sampling is done properly so that we can make a determination on risk.
The utility and local health officials examined the system, including
No, I'm just cold. I can't wherever I go.
And it'll give you a positive or even a heartbeat. It leads to a lack of confidence in your system and in your operators.
improving the testing sites and training samplers in correct testing fundamentals help restore confidence in the monitoring data, thus restoring a strong sense of confidence in the community's water quality. Clean, safe water of consistent quality and supply is the goal of every water supplier. And while we cannot routinely test every drop of water produced for every possible contaminant, we can assess the overall integrity of the water system's multiple barriers using indicators. Even though effective water treatment procedures may be carefully practiced, it is still important to regularly check the final finished product within the distribution system. And the only way to accomplish that is through reliable and representative system sampling conducted, tested, and retested on an ongoing basis. Here are 3 points to always remember. First, trained sample collectors are very important to having a reliable monitoring program. Second, clean and maintain sample taps and very good techniques for collecting samples from faucets are as important as the sample collector. And third, being ready to respond effectively to positive coliform samples and to investigate causes for positives is essential to have confidence in and securing a water distribution system that is safe from contamination. An organized, efficient, and effective sampling program for total coliform is an integral part of a water supplier's toolkit in assuring the protection of the public health.